Nothing But the Truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly X-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. Donald Trump has always been known as a leader willing to take big geopolitical risks. But the war now unfolding in the Middle East may prove to be the most consequential gamble of his presidency. It would seriously impact geopolitical and economic relations across the world, and particularly on India. So in this episode, we will answer the three big questions. What did the United States and Israel, or why did the United States and Israel choose to strike Iran now? How long could the war last? And what could it mean for countries like India? What impact would it have on India? But first, an update. Beginning on February 28th, the combined military power of the United States and Israel launched a series of strikes across Iran. It hit nuclear facilities, missile bases, and military command centers in Iran. Now, these attacks also decapitated much of Iran's political leadership, including its long-serving supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Now, the stated aim that US and Israel gave for these strikes was, it was pretty straightforward. They wanted to cripple Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities and reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. But as we know, wars rarely follow the script of those who start them. Instead of collapsing, Iran has responded with resilience. Tehran has launched waves of missiles and drones against Israel, while also targeting American bases and energy infrastructure across the Gulf. Then came an escalation that shook global markets. Iran closed the crucial Strait of Hormuz. It is that narrow waterway through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil cargo passes. In fact, cargo tankers were attacked and energy markets were jolted as global trade routes suddenly found themselves pulled into the vortex of war. The implications reach far beyond the Middle East. For India, the stakes are particularly high. We depend heavily on the region for energy supplies, and at the same time, there are more than 10 million Indians who live and work across these Gulf countries. Nearly 38% of India's total remittances of $135 billion a year come from this particular region. The war, as we know, has also taken a human toll. More than 1,000 Iranians have already been killed, both civilian and army personnel. And tragically, 85 girl children, as we've seen the photos, the stunning photos of that grave being dug, that long row of graves, that brings the tragedy straight to our houses. Now, Israel has reported 10 deaths and the United States, 6 servicemen. The conflict has come home to us as well when missiles struck 2 oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, killing 3 Indian crew members. And in another shocking incident, an American submarine torpedoed the Iranian warship IRS Dina in the Indian Ocean after it had earlier participated in a multinational naval exercise with the Indian Navy. As we know, the vessel sank with 87 sailors aboard being killed. Few conflicts in modern Middle Eastern history have begun with so many uncertainties. Now, the opening strikes, which I told you earlier, were intended to deliver a decisive shock, not just to Iran's military capabilities, but possibly to its political system as well. Instead, the war has stirred what Stephanie Williams, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy in Washington, D.C., and she calls it stirring a geopolitical hornet's nest. When I spoke to her, she had a very interesting way to describe this, and frank and candid. She told me that the US is flying blind now. I repeat that. The US is flying blind now and is in the territory of unintended consequences. That's how serious things have been. So now let's answer the first big question. Why did the US and Israel join hands to strike Iran? This is 8 months after it did so in June 2025. Remember, both Israel and USA went to war with Iran in June 2025, and so just 8 months later, they are back again fighting Iran. Now, the decision by Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to attack Iran did not emerge from, say, a single trigger. Instead, it reflected a convergence of political opportunity, intelligence signals, and shifting strategic calculations. The immediate background lies in events from the war that I mentioned, which was in June 2025. At that time, if you recall, Israel launched one of its fiercest attacks yet on Iranian military facilities, claiming that Tehran was only months away from building a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran responded with missiles and drones, and the confrontation escalated when Trump authorized a massive strike known as Operation Midnight Hammer, and the American president ordered the huge bombers to drop what are called bunker buster bombs on 3 of Iran's main nuclear sites. Now, President Trump later claimed that the strikes had totally obliterated, that's his word, Iran's nuclear capabilities. Now, Iran did retaliate by firing missiles at the American air base in Qatar, and after 12 days of intense fighting, Washington or Trump really pushed both sides towards what India today, on its cover, termed at that time, I wrote a report that time, and we called it the uneasy truce. But as we know, the lull provided only temporary relief, and Iran used the pause to rebuild itself in terms of missile batteries that were restocked, radar systems strengthened, the air defenses reportedly upgraded with Chinese assistance. I spoke to Syed Akif Zaidi, a research scholar at Al-Mustafa International University in the holy city of Qom in Iran, and he believed that the brief conflict had actually benefited Iran. As he told me, in hindsight, the 12-day war was a godsend. Iran got a chance to test all its military systems as well as the political and social structures for a prolonged conflict. Yet, the war also left Iran economically battered. Remember, it was already under heavy sanctions from the US, and the country's economy spiraled into crisis. Inflation surged to nearly 40%. The Iranian rial, which was just around 5 lakhs to the dollar, or 500,000 to the dollar, soared to something like 1.5 million riyals to the dollar within a year. And this collapse was dramatic. There was rising unemployment and cuts in subsidies for bread, fuel, and electricity, and these triggered widespread protest. By January, those protests had turned into a nationwide anti-regime movement of unprecedented proportions. Now, the authorities responded with a brutal crackdown led by the feared Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij militia, the militia that reports to the IRGC, and thousands, an estimated 7,000 people were killed and thousands arrested before the unrest was suppressed. But the protest exposed something important. The Iranian regime appeared vulnerable and its weakest. Now, Israel had observed this, and for it, the combination of economic crisis, domestic unrest in Iran, and perceived military weakness created a strategic opening. Now, recall that since the Hamas attacks of October 7th, 2023, those dreadful attacks that the Hamas had launched and killed thousands of civilians in Israel, Tel Aviv had already been dismantling Iran's network of regional allies. It first went after Hamas in Gaza and reduced it to rubble. We saw pictures of all of that, then went after Hezbollah in Lebanon and weakened that. The Houthis in Yemen were repeatedly struck, and Israel also had played a role in the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria. Remember, this was what Iran called its axis of resistance and used these proxies to target Israel and other countries that were inimical to its interest. So Israel went and weakened all of these various proxies, and meanwhile, Israel intelligence began to pick up that Iran's missile arsenal was growing rapidly, potentially reaching a level where Israel's famed air defenses, the Iron Dome, would struggle to cope. Now, after the January uprisings, Israeli leaders concluded that the moment had arrived to strike, and what they called as the head of the snake. Trump then ultimately agreed. Now, why did the US president agree to make those strikes when Israel talked to him? If you recall again, ironically, the war began even as negotiations between Washington and Tehran were still underway. Now, Iran had reportedly signaled a willingness to limit its missile program, meaning that it will not build missiles that could strike the Washington, D.C., the range that they had, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, and also it agreed to reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium. But then Trump literally abruptly broke off the talks, even when the Oman intermediaries said that they're very, very positive signals, and went on later to say, Donald Trump went on later to say, we were having negotiations with lunatics, and it was my opinion that they were going to attack the US first. Now, initially, the strikes were framed by the US as a preventive operation aimed at destroying Iran's missile infrastructure and nuclear ambitions. But as we saw, the rhetoric quickly escalated. In a televised address, Trump described the campaign, the Iran campaign, as a mission to liberate Iran from its murderous rulers. That's what he called them. And he openly called all Iranians to rise up and overthrow their government. And in a Truth Social post, he wrote soon after the decapitation strike that America carried out, or Israel actually carried out, but America supported. And he said, Khamenei, one of the most evil people in history, is dead. That's how he described it soon after the strikes. Now, the shift towards openly advocating regime change in Iran marked a dramatic escalation. Yet, when America realized that Iran's leadership structure did not collapse, the Trump administration adjusted its messaging again. So they're having shifting targets. First, they said they wanted to destroy the missile and nuclear facilities. Then they went on to say that they wanted regime change. And when they realized that that is going to be somewhat complicated, White House officials outlined 4 core objectives to the press. This is almost 4 days into the war. And they said it is to destroy Iran's missiles and drones, their capabilities on that, to prevent any nuclear weapons program of Iran now and in the future, to weaken Iran's regional influence, and ultimately, the 4th objective was empower the Iranian people to end the clerical rule. Note the change in wordings. No more was it a direct takeover, no more was it regime change as Trump would want it, but these 3 conditions or the 3 objectives would then enable and empower the Iranian people to end the clerical or theocracy that dominated it for so many years. Now, some analysts believe these shifting goals reveal the absence of a coherent strategy on the part of the US. And as one expert familiar with the region told me, we may be attributing grand strategy to what are actually decisions evolving day by day. There was really no great strategy. They kept evolving and adapting to the situation that was there while the big messaging was going on. So why didn't the regime in Iran collapse as quickly as Trump and Netanyahu had hoped for. What was the reason that Iran held and continues to hold as we speak? Now, if both the US and Israel had hoped that killing Iran's leadership would trigger the collapse of the Islamic Republic, they appear to have underestimated the resilience of the Iranian state. Mind you, Iran is not a small a state or a micro-state like the Gaza or a fragile country. It is home to more than 90 million people and occupies a vast territory surrounded by mountains and deserts. And that historically made it difficult for invaders to conquer. And that space, by the way, Iran is the 17th largest country in terms of geographical area. And if you take a look at the size of it, 4 big European countries, the geography of that would add up to what Iran has. That big it is. So it's not like you could easily overrun Iran despite having all the modern kind of weaponry that US has. Now, the regime is also deeply embedded within society. The Revolutionary Guards, the intelligence service, and clerical networks, the theocracy, together form a very powerful security apparatus. Even before his death, his assassination, Ayatollah Khamenei had anticipated the possibility of it and put in place succession mechanisms across the structure, not only in terms of his own successor, but apparently in terms of succession in the army, in the legislature, in the judiciary, and of course the Revolutionary Guard. So that was there. Now, under Iran's constitution, soon after his assassination, a 3-member interim council was formed that included, and this commission was to rule till a new supreme leader was elected or chosen. And this included the Iranian president, the chief justice, and a senior cleric. Now, former Indian ambassador to Iran, Gadam Dharmendra, told me, and when I talked to him, that the system in Iran itself remains resilient. And he went on to say, don't forget, Raj, that this is a 47-year-old ideological regime that is deeply embedded. Successive generations of people, remember 47 years this regime has run, successive generations of people are now in ruling positions and they have been weaned on this ideology. There may be internal factions, he admitted, but on the issue of regime integrity, preventing regime collapse, they're all completely united. So that's a reality that US and Israel have to contend with. Now, there is speculation that the next supreme leader could be Mojtaba Khamenei, the late leader's son. And when I spoke to Hassan al-Hassan of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Bahrain, he said that if that happens, Mojtaba is cut from the same cloth as his father. There would be continuity. We are unlikely to see a shift in Iran's position. Trump, as you know, has expressed deep unhappiness with this possible succession and demands and says that he will decide who the next Iranian leader would be, and we need to see whether that particular statement would hold in the next week or so. Now let's deal with the second big question. How long could this war, could the war last, or the war in Iran last? How long would it be in terms of duration? And that's a very, very big question and an important one. Let's be clear that how long the conflict continues will depend less on ideology and more on military arithmetic. It's simple. Iran's ability to sustain missile and drone attacks depends on the depth of its military stockpiles and the resilience of its launch infrastructure. At the same time, the United States and its allies must maintain expensive missile defense systems to intercept incoming attacks. As we've seen, there have been thousands of those attacks coming from Iran, and these interceptors are costly and inventories limited. Now, if Iran's arsenals prove deeper than expected, the tempo of the war could shift dramatically. It could last longer, and that is a serious issue. Now, Iran's broader strategy appears to have two components. The first is to pressure America's regional partners by targeting infrastructure such as ports, energy facilities, and air bases. The idea, of course, is that if you target the infrastructure around these areas, the Gulf countries will start moving towards and saying it's time to end the war, because the last thing they want is to pay the penalty for what is happening. So the idea is, if you start doing that, countries like Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and others would say, hey, we need to end this war quickly. You've decapitated the leadership. You've achieved what you wanted. Why are you doing this? So the idea behind that, behind Iran's moves, is to widen the arc of conflict rather than just try and bomb Israel, which is pretty difficult for it, given the kind of shield that it has, the Iron Dome that it has, that prevents a lot of the missiles that Iran sends. It destroys them in the air itself. Now, the second strategy that Iran has adopted is impose economic costs on the global system by threatening shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's very important also, because once, as I mentioned earlier, close to 20% of the oil cargo flows through the straits, and that would cripple a lot of countries if the Strait of Hormuz was kept closed. Of course, this strategy carries risks. So rather than splitting the coalition against Iranian strikes could push Gulf states closer to the United States. And of course, Europe and other countries impacted by it may also join the attacks against Iran in this particular case. Of course, experts that I spoke to said there are several possible outcomes of this. One is gradual political reform inside Iran. The most experts believe this is unlikely. So the fact that Iran could change because of all this immediately seems unlikely. The second is that there could be internal fragmentation or civil conflict, a kind of civil war. And this is also a possibility that after a little while, the Iranian state begins to feel the impact of whatever has been thrown at them, and there is already dissent, as I mentioned earlier, and you could end up with a lot of civil war, particularly among the minorities. They have quite a substantial percentage of them, though a majority of them are Persian by origin. There are also the Kurds and also the Azeris, apart from the Baluch. They have a mixed population over there, but the Persians dominate. The worst case scenario could be a full-scale regional war involving multiple states. Yet, there are also forces that could limit escalation. And when I spoke to former Indian diplomat, Syed Akbaruddin, a highly knowledgeable diplomat, and he points to the Gulf states themselves, telling me that these countries have enormous economic stakes in stability. Prolonged conflict will permanently damage the Gulf's reputation as a safe harbor for business. Remember, all of us, when we travel to these countries, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, we always think of them as safe. And a lot of business is transacted because they seem to be free of war and other troubles that is there. But once that reputation goes, it begins to impact business over there. Now, Akbaruddin also notes that regime change rarely happens through airstrikes alone, which is what the US has been trying, that is bombarding bombarding Iran across the country there and trying to level a lot of just not military facilities, but in some senses, as we've seen, even hit civilian targets, and Israel has done the same. And he says you can't just bomb installations or kill a few people. You will have to put boots on the ground. He's telling America that if you really want regime change, you have to get your troops over there, and then only can you bring about that. And that option is extremely risky, as America knows. Iran is far larger than Iraq, where the Americans invaded at that time, and they put close to 150,000 troops on ground. In Iran, such an invasion would require an enormous military commitment, close to 3 times that number that they put in Iraq. So that's a huge commitment from a president who said he not only wanted to put an end to what he called never-ending wars when he took over in his second term, but he also said they would like to keep America from getting into a future war and putting his own soldiers into harm's way. Now, this is, it's already upset his so-called MAGA base, or Make America Great Again supporters, and they were looking at an isolationist approach towards focusing on America and making sure that America regains its stature, not necessarily wanting to be a world's policeman. But Trump seems to have adopted this approach. Stephanie Williams told me that if the past is prologue, the outlook in Iran would be grim. It is 10 times more complex than Iraq. And so, if there's any move to put boots on the ground to invade Iran and try to bring about any regime change, it would be disastrous for the US. They had experience in the past. They never did well on that. And therefore, the duration of the war that we talked about, how long will this war last, will, as I mentioned earlier, depend on military arithmetic, how many missiles Iran has, what is the kind of interception that the surrounding countries, and including Israel, has in terms of their counter-missile facilities, and also the fact that if we looked at the strategic side of it, how much pain could Iran inflict on the Gulf to make them tell America that enough is enough, you have achieved your objectives, now let's move out of this, or in terms of the world, where a wild card is if, for instance, the entire world is impacted, big countries, Europe and other places will come and tell America, look, your objectives have been achieved, regime change is not something that you can easily put across, the world is being impacted, and so that could also be a limiting factor. We would know this in the next week or 2 weeks. Let's not forget the first war went on for 12 days, and therefore we would expect, and as Trump himself said, it could go on for more than 4 to 5 weeks, which meant that America's realized that this is not an easy war to fight, not like Venezuela, which they were able to capture the leader, Maduro, and in no time they had an alternative regime, though that regime actually owes its allegiance to, to Maduro himself. So that is something that we need to look at. But now let's answer the third big question. How will this war impact India? For India, the conflict threatens, let's call it a double whammy. There's going to be a double economic shock if the war continues. And let's answer that question. Why? The first risk is energy. India is the world's third largest consumer of oil and imports nearly 89% of its crude requirements. The country consumes more than 5 million barrels of oil each day, and all these come from the Gulf area. Oil prices have already begun rising. The Brent crude, which is the normal standard, has climbed from about $65 per barrel earlier this year to already $84 per barrel. We've already seen a rise. And if the prices cross $90 a barrel, if the conflict intensifies, that means for every $10 increase in oil prices, it raises India's import bill by roughly $14 billion annually. That's how bad it's going to be, which means that the funds that we had kept aside will get sucked up in purchasing crude oil at this price. And the ripple effect that will have, the cascading effect that will have, is that inflation will start hitting us because a lot of those prices, the increase will have to be factored in goods and services being supplied. Now, India already spends around $143 billion a year importing crude, and that could go up dramatically, again depleting our various funds that we would require for other purposes. Now, another concern is the Strait of Hormuz itself, which is one of the most important energy choke points in the world. Half of India's oil imports and more than half of its LNG, the gas supplies, pass through this very narrow waterway. And if maritime traffic is disrupted, replacing those supplies will be extremely difficult. Now, the second shock, this is the first shock, which is the energy shock that is there. The second shock could come from remittances. Remember, nearly 9.4 million Indians live in Gulf countries. Together, they send home tens of billions of dollars every year. Now, if economic activity slows across the Gulf because of the war, those remittance flows could decline sharply. The crisis, of course, also poses a diplomatic challenge. Just days before the war, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had a bilateral meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, and the optics of that meeting led many observers to see it as a tilt towards the US-Israel strategic axis. Over the past decade, India has deepened defense and technology cooperation with Israel, yet India's broader interests in West Asia lie overwhelmingly with the Gulf countries. They supply India's energy, they host millions of our Indian workers, as I mentioned a little earlier, and they account for a major share of remittances. For decades, India maintained a careful balancing act, building ties simultaneously with Israel, Iran, and the Arab world. But as tensions escalate, maintaining that balance may become increasingly difficult. And that, perhaps, is the deeper question emerging from this huge conflict. Not just how long the war will last, but how it will reshape the geopolitics of an entire region, and where countries like India will ultimately find themselves in the new landscape. That is the big challenge. For more details, you can read my in-depth cover story of the conflict in Iran in the latest issue of India Today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing But the Truth.